Welcome to this series of videos on Micro Focus Content Manager and the installation and configuration process. We previously saw an overview of the capabilities and components. In this episode, we will see the installation of the core components of Content Manager, the minimum you need to run Content Manager. And this is these components on this chart here. We will start with installing the workgroup server. Here it is, and activate the license, register the service account, register the workgroup server as well in the configuration, initialize the metadata in the database to have a database created for Content Manager, and we will also connect to a document store in order to be able to store the electronic documents. We will then deploy all this configuration, kind of compilation, and finally we will install the desktop client to check that everything is working. So let's have a look at this configuration. I'm here connected to my server. In this process I will just use a single machine, so a kind of appliance if you wish, where everything is installed, my database, Content Manager, everything in one. It can work with small installation. Small company can work with this type of configuration. So we have here downloaded Content Manager, the last release 10, and I have unzipped the kit on my server where I will install it. So I will go first in this 60-bit, 64-bit install folder, and this is where I have all the packages, all the MSI file that allows me to install the components. We have a wizard, and I will work with this one. So usually you will run it as administrator. I'm here on the server administrator, but if you're not run it as administrator, that's important. We will install in the default folder, agree with the license term, and this is where I can check what components I want to install. So here I will start with installing just the server portion to show how this works, and it asks me what's my service account, so the service that will run my application. So let's check the credentials so that we're sure we're okay. This is also where I will put all the data, so the configuration files and information for the software. So this service account will need obviously to have rights to run as a service, and I will click install here so that it can start working on it. It will copy the files and configure everything. It will take a couple of minutes in this process. After 1 or 2 minutes, the installation is completed. I am now ready to continue. I have installed with Content Manager a tool which is called the Enterprise Studio. That's the next step for me to go to. This is where I will be able to configure my environment, my database, my workgroup servers. So here I will have only one workgroup server, but I can have multiple ones for scalability and availability. The first thing to do will be in my demonstration environment to go to the license tab and put my license, so I can import my license file if I have bought the product, but here I will just run the evaluation license, and I have some time to evaluate the product. I have then the possibility to register my workgroup server. So my workgroup server will also be the one that connects to my file system to be able to store my electronic documents. That's what we call the document store. So here I will simulate it with a folder locally on my computer and call it cm doc store. This will be a doc store for my training DB. All right, I will share this folder to simulate completely that we are on a NAS server, for example. So let's share it with this name, put the permission. I will add the administrators here. This will obviously need to be our service account that I have access to that share. All right, administrator. Let's put it full control. Apply. OK. All right. So now I am able to connect to this share. Fine. Let's copy that and start the registration of our workgroup. So I go back in my Enterprise Studio and create a workgroup server. The server name is my local server here, which is Win02. I will keep the default here to make it simple. The default will work in most of the cases. All right. So we have our workgroup server ready. Next thing to do is to create a dataset. The dataset, that's where we store all the metadata that we will keep in the system. For that, I need a database. So in my case, I have SQL Server. My SQL Server will need a new database that I will create here. And this database will be an empty database that we will populate with the Content Manager configuration tool. So I call this database Training DB, and this is it. Let's click OK. We have a database. It's currently empty. Let's go back to our dataset and create a dataset. Dataset name, I will put the same name to be sure that I have consistency, and I need to put an identifier. So that's a two-character identifier, short identifier. We'll put 12. Whatever you want is fine. It can be digit or letters. Click Next, and now we need to connect to our database. So we need a connection string. We have this tool, so let's go back here. If we click on this icon here, we have the possibility to generate the connection string with this tool. I will use the driver, so that's a prerequisite on the server. It's recommended to have the ODBC driver 17 for SQL. And my server name, I will connect via Windows authentication, but I could potentially use my SA account if needed. And we will discover our databases. So that's good. We see our training DB that appears, so the one that I just created in my database tool. And test connection is successful. That's great. Let's click OK, and we see our connection string, so the parameters for the ODBC driver that is populated here. So we are fine. Let's go next. We will keep the default settings here because that's not the purpose of this video. We will come back on that later, and we'll be able to configure these things later. Bulk loading the same. This one is interesting. That's the default document store. So that's why I've created this folder that I've shared, and that simulates my document store, my NAS server, where I can store my electronic documents. So I give the path here to this store, and we will be then able to use it as a document store. Click Next and Next. This is a new data set, so we want to create this dataset. It's not an existing one that we want to migrate. And we are now ready with creating this dataset. So little warning here to be sure that you're ready to start, and I click the start button. So after a few seconds we will see our dataset appearing, and we will have the possibility to check that in our database tool. It's done. All right, we have the dataset here, training DB. Let's check that the database is created. F5 to refresh. We have the tables. Fine. This is our database ready. Good. Let's close that. We have our training database ready. We are fine to try to connect to this database. So together with the installation of Content Manager server, you have the Content Manager administration interface that appears here on the desktop. And it asks you when you first connect to create a connection name. So we will create a new connection. We will identify the dataset we want to connect to. So a dataset, that's a kind of partition inside Content Manager that you will connect to. And here this is dataset number 12 as we have defined it, and the server is Win02 still. We have the possibility to authenticate in different ways. I will use here the integrated Windows authentication, meaning that it will capture the user I'm logged in with in this interface right now, but I can also ask an interaction during the connection so that I specify a specific account, and other possibilities are available as well. Alright, so here I have an error message. That's not so problematic. It's just that we didn't do something very important, which is when you create all this configuration, you need to save it and click the deploy button. So deploy button will allow you to send the configuration to all the workgroup servers. So we now see it's deployed. We can do an additional test and verification, I would say, and look at the services, be sure that the service is started. That's something which is a good thing to do. Let's have a look. Content Manager Workgroup Service. We see that it's running. It's in automatic mode, and our user running the service is the CM service. Fine, so now it's deployed and it should work better. That's it. We have registered our dataset in this administration interface, and we can connect with the OK button. And that's it. We are connected now to this interface for the administration. So I will have here the basic capabilities for an administrator to manage what you have inside the configuration, the environment, with different things synchronized with the Active Directory and so on and so forth. But one thing is interesting, is to have an interface for the end user. So what we will do now is to install the client, the desktop client. So I will install it on the same server here, but obviously in a normal environment, in a usual environment, you will install that on the client on Windows PC of the users. So let's get back in this folder where I have Content Manager, where I have all the kits, and I have one which is called CM Client. So I can run that with a double click, and it will install all the files that are needed for the client. Small ask here, I have the possibility to install plugins with Word, Excel, and Outlook. I will check the one that I have installed on this PC and click next, next, and next. The client is now installed, and we will try it and see how this is working. So we have two types of client. One is the Content Manager desktop, which is less and less used because there is now a web interface. That's a reduced version of the full client that we see here. This full client, we see that we have already registered with the administration interface, our training DB, and we are now ready to connect. So you will see that this interface is containing a bit more things that are useful for the end user, and this is where the end user will be able to do all his job in terms of filing in the documents, and this interface goes up to configuring file plans, schedules, and all the things that you can do in Micro Focus Content Manager. So this is it for the installation of the core components. Let's continue with other videos on the other part of Content Manager.